So anyways, you can see how many English translations of the Bible there are, and this actually isn't even all of them. And this isn't all of the editions of all of them. So the English Bible is very well known and it's very popular. You can surmise why. So to begin with, one of the most famous English translations would be Tyndale's translation. William Tyndale was a scholar in the 16th century. He was born in the 15th century, and he also died for his translation. The church and the English government did not want the Bible in English, and when he was caught and arrested, he was eventually executed for translating the Bible into English. Tyndale's Bible, though, has influenced all English Bibles down to the present. And how is that so? Well, first of all, Tyndale's, although it's not the first English Bible, it then influenced the Great Bible, the Geneva Bible, the Bishop's Bible, and the King James Version of the Bible were all, as time goes on, you're translating, you look at how others have translated also, and you can find Tyndale in the Great Bible, Tyndale in the Geneva Bible, and Tyndale in the King James Bible. Now, how can that be seen? That can be seen in certain words that were translated by Tyndale one way and then subsequently have always been translated that way. One of those would be the traditional word ecclesia. Ecclesia is always translated church. Ecclesia is not a perfect translation, or I should say church is not a perfect translation of the word ecclesia. A perfect translation of the word ecclesia would be gathering or assembly. You can see, though, that Tyndale understood by his day the assembly, we simply call it the church. And so we're going to just use that word in place of assembly or gathering. Another example of this would, of course, be baptism. Baptism is not actually an English word. It's a Greek transliteration. It's taking the Greek form of the word and anglifying it, basically. Baptizo would be the Greek form of the word, and if we were to translate it literally, we would translate it dip. Or we would translate it immerse, or we would translate it submerge, because that's what the word literally means in English. But you can see that the word baptism in the English church was already being used, and therefore they just transliterate baptismo into baptism. Other carryovers would be, by the time of Tyndale, they already had established pronunciation, English pronunciation of Greek words and Hebrew words. One of the more famous, well-known would, of course, be Jesus. We all know the name Jesus, right? That's not how it would have been pronounced in the first century. It would have been pronounced much closer to Joshua, only it still wouldn't have that hard J sound. It would have a Y sound. So it would be much closer to Yeshua. The same with other hard J sounds, especially when we find them in the Hebrew Bible. Jerusalem, Jehovah, etc., etc. The thing is, there is no hard J sound in ancient Hebrew. But again, by the time Tyndale is translating in the 16th century, those words are already the way we say them in English. And so we're simply carrying them over into the Bible. And from Tyndale, that again extends to the Geneva Bible, the Great Bible, and the Bishop's Bible. Those three Bibles heavily influenced the King James Version, and still to this day. You buy a modern translation, and even what we call the more word-for-word translations, those are where they're finding the Hebrew word, they're finding the Greek word, and they're trying to find the perfect English word that captures that meaning. They're still going to use our traditional words. Jerusalem, Jesus, maybe not Jehovah. You've seen that Jehovah, the name Jehovah has been supplemented with the capital L-O-R-D in many translations, or even in more modern translations it is spelled Yahweh, and it has become pretty standard to have that in certain Bibles. Why are there so many translations? Well, in 2009, a man named not William Tyndale, a man named Bart Ehrman published a book, and his book was titled Misquoting Jesus. And in the book he said that when we lay out all of our manuscripts of the New Testament, there are literally thousands of variances. And to that point, he is correct. But there's much more data to understand that point, only he didn't provide the other data to understand that point. He just saw, hey, a controversial book sells more than a non-controversial book, and so a title like Misquoting Jesus, that's a nice controversial title. And that data point that I just gave, it's an accurate data point, and it sounds much more scandalous than it actually is. And of course, scandal sells, right? And so he made a lot of money on that book. There is no work of antiquity, of the ancient world, that has more copies than the works within the New Testament today. We have more than 5,500 manuscript Greek copies of the New Testament. That is to say, we either have a little minuscule, we have a parchment or a papyrus that has a couple verses, or we have a complete book, or, especially later, and we talked a little bit about codexes in the past, we have complete collections of books. So when we lay them all out on the table, we have more than 5,500 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. A manuscript is any handwritten copy. So here we're distinguishing it from much later, after the inventing of the printing press, and especially after the inventing of the computer. I think we're good. A variant is any difference when we have the same text in two locations. So we have a manuscript and it has John, the Gospel of John. And then we have another manuscript and it has the Gospel of John. And we look at these two copies, and any difference, absolutely any difference, counts as a variant. And so if somebody skips a letter, that's a variant. If somebody switches word orders, that's a variant. Any difference is a variant. And this is not something that the church, be it the Catholic Church or be it the Christian Church or anybody, it's not something that we're trying to keep secret. In fact, in Munster, Germany, there is the Institute of the New Testament, and they have taken photographs of every single manuscript that we have, and they have a catalog of absolutely every variant that has ever been discovered in any manuscript. What kind of variants do you think we find? Well, by far, the majority of all our variances are spelling differences. So somebody tell me, is theater spelled right or is theater spelled right? I like that answer, yes. It has much more to do with what side of the Atlantic Ocean you're on, determining which one is spelled right. And the same is true with color. Is it spelled right or is that spelled right? Once again, it depends on what country you're standing in, whether it's spelled right. That by far is the majority of the variances when we lay out all 5,000 of those manuscripts. We find spelling variances. Anybody who's ever seen my handwriting knows that I am very creative when it comes to spelling. Can I get an amen? The other thing is nonsense errors, and here is my test for anybody with OCD. Nonsense errors, they happen every time we write anything. It can happen just because you're in a hurry writing. One of the things is you can writing a letter twice. See it? When it should have been written, see it? Once, or vice versa. Just because it's in English doesn't mean it doesn't happen in other languages also. How many of you get confused with double T's? Double T's are one of the worst things, if you ask me. Reversing the proper order of the letters. Does anybody see it? Obviously here, since I did this on a computer, I intentionally did this. And then on your notes, I intentionally did this. How many will confess, though, if you're writing a note, you do this? You don't intentionally do it, it just happens. Happens to me more than it happens to you. Making two words one, or making two words two. You see it? Once again. This happens in manuscripts. And personally, this is another problem in my head. We have so many conjunctions. We have so many conjunctions. We also have words that are sometimes two, only we pronounce them as one. And I get so confused without the help of a computer over, is this one word or is this two words? Using two words that sound the same. Do you see it? Using two words that sound the same. I did that intentionally also. We see this in manuscripts where somebody accidentally copies something twice, or the exact opposite can happen where they accidentally seem to omit something. And when we look at the rest of their work, it doesn't seem to suggest they're intentionally omitting stuff. It's just naturally happened. Finally, skipping a letter by accident. Skipping a letter, skipping a word, what have you. These two categories, spelling errors and nonsense errors, are the majority of all of our variances. When we lay out all 5,500 copies, we find these. Tell me something. Of these, are these nonsense errors, should we just give up? Or can you figure out what they are? Yeah, exactly. And the same is true when it comes to the spelling errors and the nonsense errors in the Greek New Testament, especially when we're talking about scholars who are scholars in Greek. The same way, you're not even a scholar in, you are, but you're not even a scholar in English, are you? And yet you can figure out these differences, right? So a Greek scholar can obviously be reading along and realize he skipped a letter. He copied a letter twice. He skipped a word. All of those kinds of things.
How many variants are in the catalog?
There are literally thousands. Literally thousands. Because once again, we're talking about hand-copied manuscripts. If we were to do the same thing, if we were to have the Declaration of Independence right here, big bold letters, and everybody had an assignment of copying it word for word, we're going to get variances just in this small sample group, right? Mine's going to have the most variances, just so you know. But then, can we then sit down with everybody's copy, even if the original was destroyed? Could we sit down with everybody else's copy, and could we figure out what the original said? If there's a variant over here, but everybody else doesn't have that variant, what's the most likely scenario? The variant is wrong. Right? And mine is going to have so many creative spellings that they're going to have me instituted, I swear. The other. So our first category is spelling differences. Our second category is nonsense errors. Our next category, differences that make no difference. What does that mean? Well, for example, in Greek, the name John can be spelled with one or two nuns. That is the Greek letter nun right there. If you look at it, it's kind of like our N upside down. If you were to flip it right side up, to us it would look kind of like an N, wouldn't it? Although now to us it looks kind of like a U, or maybe depending on how you make a V, it looks like that. In Greek, you can spell the name John with one N or two N's. And it makes no difference. And we find that. We find that several times. We find that with John the Baptist. We find that with John the Apostle. And if John the Elder is a different person, we find it with John the Elder. I think it's the same person, but that's my opinion. When we find that, and we translate that into English, we translate it with one N. Because in English, the name John has one N. Whether it's Jon or it's John. Did I get that right? Good. Regardless, that's just how we spell it. So it doesn't matter. The other thing that often happens, we have some copies of Luke and Acts where they have the definite article in front of the proper noun. The shepherds went to find the Mary and the Joseph. The book of Acts talks about the resurrection of the Jesus. He also refers to the Paul. Greek scholars kind of debate, why is this? Because it's not common in Greek. Is it a more formal way of addressing it? That's one of the theories on why some of our manuscripts have the definite article in front of the proper noun. We don't translate it that way into English because we don't speak that way. We can have the definite article in front of a noun, sit at the table, but we don't put the definite article in front of the proper noun. The Christie sat at the table. That would just sound so weird, wouldn't it? And if you started talking like that, people would look at you kind of funny, wouldn't they? So we find variances like this. We wonder why the person did this, but we don't know why. And even when we translate it into English, it doesn't matter because we don't speak that way.
Was that ever present, though, in other documents not related to the Bible? That was like maybe some particular dialect or something?
And that would be great if we could find that and establish a Greek rule that this is more formal or something like that. It's still unanswered. They don't know why. Sometimes some documents have the definite article in front of it and some don't. You know? We would love to just call the past and say, hey, can you explain this to us, you know? Now, here's another category. It's a rather middle range category. The other two categories are the majority of them. But here we get, it's a meaningful difference, but it lacks witness. And what I mean by that is whatever the variant is, it changes the meaning. Or it adds to the meaning, or it subtracts from the meaning. But lacking witness means it's only present in a few of our manuscripts, or it's very, very late in our manuscripts. A good example of this would be what we call the Johannine comma. The Johannine comma, I give it to you there in your notes. The Johannine comma is a clause that appears after 1 John chapter 5 verse 7 and before verse 8. If you have a King James version of the Bible, here you see it translated in the King James. For there are three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost. And these three are one. However, the majority, and I do give you a couple other translations that contain the Johannine comma, the majority of translations do not contain it. They simply end verse 7 at, for there are three that testify, and then it goes on into verse 8. Now, why is this? Well, we have it in a few Greek manuscripts. We have it in Greek manuscripts that date somewhere between the 14th and the 16th century. So we're somewhere more than 1,000 years after original John wrote 1 John. It's found in 8 Greek manuscripts. 4 of those times it's not even found in the body of the text. It's found in the margins of the text. And moreover, despite the fact that we have great Trinitarian debates in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th century, we have no early church father quoting this passage. Is this passage a terrific defense of the Trinity? Yeah, it's a terrific defense of the Trinity. It pretty much spells out the doctrine of the Trinity right there, doesn't it? The problem is, it's probably not in the original. And we don't have early citation by church fathers telling us that it's in the original. Just in case anybody happens to know, we don't believe that Cyprian, in the 3rd century, church father Cyprian, we don't believe that he's quoting this because he's not talking about 1 John in that text. We believe he's just using common vernacular that at the time it was very common to say the Father, the Word, and the Spirit, and these three are one. And therefore, since he's not referring to 1 John, this is probably not a citation of 1 John. Oh, I thought you had a question. So now, here's where one of our early controversies jump up at us. Ever since more publications after the King James, some people have taken their King James Bible, they've opened it up and they found a verse, and they said, you use your NIV and you find that verse, and you use your New Living and you find that verse, and you use your New American Standard and you find that verse, and you're going to say it's not there, and you're going to say it's not there, and you're going to say it's not there, and they're going to say, see, they're editing the Bible. They're taking things out of the Bible. Well, let's look at that argument a little bit closer, and let's ask ourselves, is the King James the source? Is it the source of authority, or is 1 John and our copies of 1 John the authority? Because when we have things like this that don't appear until much later in our manuscripts, it's probably very unlikely that it goes back to the original. And if it doesn't go back to the original, is it Bible? Our next category is a very, very, very small category. It's meaningful and it's possible. Meaning it's not a spelling error, it's not a nonsense error, and it changes the meaning of the text. And we have good witness to the variants. In other words, it appears in multiple manuscripts, or it appears in multiple church fathers' quotations of it. One of the easiest ones to understand is here in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 12. In the New American Standard, it's, for our proud confidence is this, the testimony of our conscience, that in holiness and godly sincerity, in the International Standard Version, for this is what we boast about, our confidence testifying that we conduct ourselves in the world with pure motives. Here are our variances. Holiness or pure motives. Now look at those two Greek words. What do you notice right away? Different spelling, but they look very similar. They start with the same letter and they end with the same letters. In fact, there's 4 letters that are our variant, creating the confusion. In the first one we have a gamma and an iota. In the second one we have a p and a lambda. You can see why a word spelled like this, it would be very easy to create this variant, right? I mean, we can see this in English when we think about words like descent and decent. Descent and decent. Or, for example, grace and grave. They're just one letter difference. Obviously, the context of the sentence will help us determine, did he mean to say grace there or did he mean to say grave there? Because, those are not two words that you would often interchange with each other, right? That being said, here's the problem. We have good manuscripts that have holiness. We have good manuscripts that have pure motives. And in fact, I tell you, they're English Bibles. 9 English Bibles translate it holiness, and 8 English Bibles translate it pure motives. Those are the ones that I could access online and find this very easily. As you could see at the beginning, we had so many translations of the Bible that I was not able to find them all. But here, I want to ask you a true question. Is this a true variant? Do these two words mean different things? Yes, they mean different things. Does it really change what he's saying, though? Does it really alter it or give it a completely different? Is he saying that you should live with holiness, or is he saying you should live with pure motives? Either or. They're not that different. Yes, they're different, but they're not that different. What does it change about our knowledge about God? Nothing. What does it change about our knowledge about Christ? What does it change about our knowledge about the church or the Christian message or anything? Nothing. So it's a meaningful variant, and it's a possible variant, but what does it really change? And keeping in mind, once again, there are less, when we've laid out all of the manuscripts, when we've tallied all of the variances, less than 1% of all of our variances fall into this category. And this is a good sample of what you see. It could be this word, it could be that word. We don't know. And yes, it changes the meaning, but it doesn't alter it. It doesn't dynamically change it. There are two positions that, if you ask me, so this is my opinion, if you ask me, there are two opinions that are completely illogical. One we're going to call the Ehrman position. And that is, because there are differences, we can't figure out anything. It's hopeless. The other position we'll call the certainty position. And really, only the King James onlyists fall into this category, where they say these manuscripts show certainty, and we absolutely know that it's holiness, or we absolutely know that it's pure motives. Those are our two extremes, and when you have two extremes, it's usually much better to be somewhere in between the two extremes, right? We have, when we've laid out all our manuscripts, we've identified 3 manuscript families. If we were in an actual course where we were talking about biblical criticism and so forth, yes, we could argue, are there more families? Are there families inside of these families? We'll let scholars debate that until they're blue in the face, all right? For our purposes this morning, and as a general truth, there are 3 text types. There's the Western text type. You can see that's Europe. There's the Byzantine text type, that's the Eastern text type, and then there's the Alexandrian text type, that's the Africa and the South text type. There are variances that are unique to manuscripts, and when we see that variant crop up in a couple manuscripts, we seem to think they must be related. If we were to draw out their genealogy, we would think that one might be a copy of the other, or they both might be a copy of a common source. And when we've laid all of those out, we start to see that there are variances that are Byzantine variances. There are variances that are Alexandrian variances. And there are variances that are Western variances. They're unique. Or they're unique to 2 of them, but not the same one. Now, these variances might not be a bad thing. They might not be a bad thing. Because when we can identify when a variant enters the text, if we can prove that the variant doesn't enter the text until much later, then it's probably not a valid variant, right? It's only when we have 2 texts that are very early and they contain a variant that there we might have a little bit of a debate over what was the original reading, probably. Another thing that can happen that's very helpful is if a church father quotes the New Testament, if his quotation contains the variant, that can help us isolate the variant. If, for example, Justin Martyr quotes the New Testament and contains the variant, that dates the variant to the 2nd century. That means it was there sometime in the 2nd century and it was known in the West. If, for example, John Chrysostom quotes the New Testament and it contains a variant, that means that that variant is known in the 4th century in the Byzantine texts. Or if Augustine quotes the text and it has the variant, that shows that the variant is at least from the 4th or from the 5th century and it's from the Alexandrian. But if they quote the New Testament and it doesn't contain the variant, that gives us some indication that it wasn't known to them or it wasn't a variant in their day, meaning it must be after the 2nd century, it must be after the 4th century, it must be after the 5th century. Once again, telling us that if the variant enters the text later, it probably doesn't go back to the original. That makes sense, right? The oldest family is the Alexandrian family. It dates to the 2nd century, and we have examples that might date to the 1st century. Here in the Alexandrian, we get papyrus. That is the reeds glued together and the writing. It's much more likely in the other two families we're going to get vellum or we're going to get codexes. We're probably not going to get papyrus. Papyrus tells us that it's probably much earlier because papyrus was much cheaper, it was easily portable, and even the poor could get their hands on papyrus. Whereas vellum and paper and parchment, those become expensive as we move into the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, and those are not available to the poor. Those are available to the middle class or to the upper classes. Most of our modern translations today are based on the Alexandrian text type. That's because it's the oldest text type, meaning it's closer to the original. If it's closer to the original, there's less chance that variances have entered the text. Here again, and we'll explain the difference between the Western and between the Alexandrian and the Byzantine text. Once again, if a variant doesn't appear in the Alexandrian text and it's not old, then it's probably not going to be in your modern translation. Which once again, the King James Onlyists are going to say, see, they're taking things out of the Bible. And the counter argument is no, they're not. They're going to the source. They're going to a much earlier date and seeing that that text isn't probably in the original. I will cite, there are people who argue for the age of the Byzantine text. I'll let them make their argument. I'm not going to make their argument.
Where does the interlinear Bible fall?
Interlinear Bibles and Greek New Testaments, especially today, you'll often find the Greek text, and you'll often find what scholars have decided is probably the majority, or is probably the most likely. Sometimes there, though, you will get a subtext saying that there is a variant reading here, and that variant reading could be pure motives or it could be holiness.
Are there any interlinear published today?
Yes. There's.
Did the fire at the library
Oh, believe me, if we knew what was at the library in Alexandria, I mean, what was lost in that? I start to cry when I think about it because, we would have ancient copies of both the Hebrew and the Greek New Testament by that point. We would have more copies of Greek, and especially the Koine Greek, which we're talking about, which would just open us up to even more possible meanings of words or understandings of words. It would be so good if the fire at Alexandria hadn't happened. I'm starting to cry again. Erasmus of Rotterdam, 1466 to 1536. He was a scholar, he was a priest, he was a critic of corruption in the church and indulgence. Who does that sound like? Luther. Guess who Luther liked? Luther liked this guy. In 1516, he published a complete New Testament Greek edition. That Greek New Testament is kind of the text behind the text. Does that make sense? If I say a text is behind a text, am I communicating well? It's the text behind Textus Receptus. Textus Receptus is the Greek New Testament that was accepted in the 16th centuries as the received text. And what stood behind it was Erasmus's text. So very few additions from Erasmus's text became Textus Receptus. Textus Receptus was the text, the Greek text behind Luther's Bible, behind Tyndale's Bible, and behind the King James Bible. So when Luther was translating in Germany, when Tyndale was translating both in England and in Germany, and when the translators of the King James in England were translating the King James, they were using Textus Receptus as their source for the Greek New Testament, translating it into German or translating it into English. The sources that Erasmus had were 7 Greek texts available to him in Basel, Switzerland in the 14th and the 15th century. So as he's working to compile his Greek New Testament, he has 7 sources to work from. All 7 of those were Byzantine text type, and none of them were very old. None of them predated the 10th or 11th century, depending on who you ask. So, when we think about Erasmus's contribution to our knowledge of the New Testament, his contribution to our knowledge of the New Testament is limited because he was limited. He only had access to 7 texts. All of them were Byzantine, and none of them were very old. Since the 17th century, more Greek manuscripts have become available than ever before. We have found literally thousands, I told you, 5,500 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament available today. Much more than 7, and representing all 3 of the families, not just one of those families. Do you guys remember I told you a little bit about Codex Sinaiticus? It's the codex that was found at St. Catherine's Monastery in the 19th century. So if we're in the 19th century, then we're some 3 centuries after Erasmus. We're some 2 centuries after King James and Luther. And so when they discovered Codex Sinaiticus was of the Alexandrian text type. Its text type was much, much, much older than the Byzantine text types that were used when translating Erasmus and then when translating the King James and so forth. So basically, once again, because of our discoveries of Greek New Testaments, our knowledge of the Greek Testament has exploded far beyond what Erasmus, Tyndale, Luther, all of those guys ever had. Why are there differences? When we put the King James here and when we put any other English translation up here, why are there differences? Because the King James is a translation of limited samples from the Byzantine text. And our modern translations are from a much larger sample of text type, and older is preferred. So not only, then, are there differences between the King James and the other translations. When we put all of our translations out here, by the way, this might not be in your notes, so maybe here you want a pen or a paper, a pen or a pencil. When we put the NIV and the NASB, when we put the NIV and the Living, when we put any of them up there, we're going to find variances between our English texts. What's going on there? Well, we have different translation theories, and this works still to this day. When we translate modern languages, Chinese, to another language, there's theory about how to translate a word into another language. And you've got to admit that we have words that we use in English that other English speakers will know right away based on the context of what we're saying, how we're saying it, right? But a non-native English speaker who doesn't know the variety of a word may not understand what we're saying, right? One theory of translation theory would be functional equivalent. Functional equivalence used to be called dynamic equivalent. And this is much more when the Greek or the Hebrew scholar sits down and reads the ancient language. He then sits there and he thinks about what's the meaning of that sentence? And how would I take the meaning of that sentence and how would I translate it into an English sentence that would make sense? And this is helpful, but also sometimes hurtful. For example, in John 3, we get the Greek word pneuma. The Greek word pneuma is the word for wind. It's also the it's also the word for breath. It's also the word for spirit, either our spirit or the Holy Spirit. And there's a play on words going on in John chapter 3, where Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, and the Spirit moves, the wind moves, and so forth. Now, Bibles like the Good News Translation, the New Living Bible, or the Message Bible, these are much more samples of that kind of translation, where the person has sat down, thought about the meaning. What is the meaning? Not necessarily what are the words, but what are the meanings, and how would we say that then in English? The other would be formal equivalents or functional equivalents. That's when here is the Greek word. What is the best English word that matches that Greek word? And here it is. There we go. Move on to the next word. What would be the next? And so you get the best or the most functional translation of the words. But then in English you have a bit of a garbled sentence, because Greek syntax and Hebrew syntax is nothing like English syntax. And so then the translator has to sit there and has to decide, how do I take those words, keeping them those words, and put it into a sentence that you and I would understand? This is why you'll see in, for example, the New American Standard, which would be very, very, very far on this side of the scale, you'll find words in italics as you're reading along. That italics means it's not there in the Greek. It means it's there in the English to make the sentence a readable, understandable English sentence. Here we get, these are often called the literal translations or the word-for-word translations. The New American Standard, the King James, the English Standard, those kinds of Bibles would fall into this category. But here we have a little bit of a problem with the Greek language and the word love, because we have 4 different Greek words for the word love. Okay, one of them is only used once in the New Testament, but the other ones, eros, thank you. Eros, agape, and philia. And you've probably heard that agape is that true love or sacrificial love or some sort of ultimate love. Eros is, of course, that romantic kind of love. And philos or philia is that kind of brotherly love. But the problem is the only word in English we have for it is love. And the word love in English does so many things. It's a very busy word. I love my wife. I love chili dogs. I just said 2 completely different sentences, and yet I said the exact same word, didn't I? And so here, that's where, even when we're trying to be formal in the equivalent, we'll still change things. We'll still add romantic love or brotherly love.
But we did understand the difference between the love that you have for your wife and the love that you have for your children. It's inherent because we're raised with that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because we speak this language already, and because we know how we use the word love, I mean, you love your car, you love your house, you love your dog. I would love to go on a vacation. You know, all these ways that we use the word love, and nobody was confused that, wait, he loves his car? Like, well, with that, unless there are any questions, we are at a terrific place to take our break. I hope I've communicated why there are differences. No English Bible falls just into one category there of our 2 kinds of translation, just a word for word or a thought for thought, because translating is a difficult thing. And the subject matter, what we're talking about, will also affect how we translate things. Can we translate them literally, or do we have to translate them in some sort of thought for thought or understanding? Now, one of the ways that comes through that's most evident and easy to explain, keeping in mind that this is just one example, there are hundreds of examples not related to this, but of the same vein, where if we translate the word literally, it's not going to communicate. But if we translate it thought for thought, then we're getting into some interpretation before we've even translated it. Now, this example would be the male reproductive organ. Yes, the Bible does talk about the male reproductive organ. It also talks about the female reproductive system and cycle and so forth. And that brings up a good question. How do we talk about that in polite society? Well, we do have proper names in English for body parts and for cycles and for things of that nature. We also have slang terms. Slang terms are often kind of, descriptive, but a bit coarse, and you don't really use that kind of language in polite society. And in those cases, we often have euphemism. Euphemism would be a way to say it in a more polite kind of way. The Bible is the same, as in the Hebrew text never actually uses the Hebrew word for the male reproductive organ. There you see the Hebrew word for flesh. That word is not the Hebrew word for the male organ. Now, in a text like Genesis chapter 17, verse 11, here Abram is getting his name changed. He's entering the Abrahamic covenant. And of course, the sign of the Abrahamic covenant is circumcision. Genesis chapter 17, verse 11 in the NIV, you shall circumcise yourself in the flesh of your foreskin. The word flesh there is the Hebrew word for flesh. That same Hebrew word is the exact same word used in Exodus chapter 12, verse 8. There, God is talking to Moses about the Passover lamb, and they shall eat the flesh of the Passover lamb. And the word there is flesh. It's not the male organ. And so, the text uses metaphor. Now, in this case, because of the context, you can see when you look at the various translations. The NIV, you shall undergo... Excuse me, I made a mistake earlier. That was not the NIV that I originally said was. Here, the NIV, you will undergo circumcision. The New Living Translation, you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin. The New American Standard Bible, which is a very literal word for word, you shall be circumcised in the flesh. So here, the word flesh in Hebrew, because of the context, because it talks about circumcision and because it talks about foreskin, the translation doesn't need to really change. Flesh is a good translation there in that the idea is communicated. Nobody looks at that with circumcision and with foreskin mentioned and ponders, what would flesh be? We all know what it would be. However, there's another example in the Bible, this in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 11, referring to the male reproductive organ. And there you see the Hebrew word, and its literal translation would be that which excites shame. This is the passage where if two men are fighting and one of the wives of one of the men come and help her husband by seizing the other man by his that which excites shame. Well, now that's not a very good translation. It's not that we couldn't figure it out. It's just that's kind of an awkward way to say it. That's not really going to help in, cutting through the awkwardness of saying it in public, reading it, for example, in church or in Bible study or so forth. How do the Bible translations deal with it? Well, you can see the NIV translates it, seizes him by his private parts. The NASB, the word-for-word translation, translates it as genitals. And that brings up a good conversation, and that is, how do we translate in a way that communicates the original and is readable in church? You can't be terribly cross with your translation in church, knowing that you'll have a wide variety of ages, a wide variety of social experience, a wide variety of what is proper and what is not proper represented in churches. And how do you translate these rather sensitive words, not just when it relates to the male organ, but when it relates to basically anything when it comes to the body. There we really do have to ask, is there a metaphorical, is there a euphemism kind of way to translate it, that we can communicate what is going on, but we can say it in such a way that it's not going to be terribly offensive. Now, one challenge to this would be some places where we're pretty sure that euphemism is going on. We're pretty sure that they're saying something there. It's not explicit. And the same way that we have ways of saying things in our language, not unlike other things that we've talked about in English, where a native English speaker will know that if you say this phrase, you'll know what it means. And nobody will need to help you understand it. Whereas a non-native English speaker may hear that phrase and may not understand what it was that was just said. One example of this, when I was teaching a class in Oregon once, we had a large crowd of people in the room, and we were talking about how Christians read the Bible, understand the Bible, and why it's important to interpret as you're going along. Most of the audience, in fact, whatever 99% of the audience, was native English speakers. One lady was not a native English speaker. She was born and raised in Germany. She spoke German. And so we got to a particular passage, and I was talking about how you have to read things in context. In Acts chapter 15, the church decides that circumcision is no longer going to be required, or excuse me, I should say, it is not required for Gentiles who want to come to Christ. It's not. But chapter 16, then, Paul goes ahead and circumcises Timothy. And you would think, wait a minute, on the surface here, it seems like there could be a contradiction. The church just decided Gentiles don't need to be circumcised. However, in this chapter, Paul is going on to circumcise him. And there you have to read into who Timothy is and why circumcision would be beneficial for him, whereas later Paul will talk about in his letters that other Gentiles were not circumcised and were not compelled to be circumcised. At that point in our discussion, I said I wanted to find a way to make an appropriate circumcision joke at this time, but I thought that would be a little off the topic. And I got the reaction, because my slip there was intentional, I got the reaction from every English speaker in the room that I wanted. They were all laughing. Now the German lady looked at everybody like, why are you laughing? I loved it because the husband then, who was a native English speaker born in America, looked at her and said, German, German, German. That is, he said something to her in German. And she responded, ja. And he continued, German, German, German. Ja, German, 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 German. Oh, she started to laugh. She got the joke. One passage that we're almost certain there is euphemism going on in the passage comes to us from 1 Kings chapter 20. You can see that the same passage is in 2 Chronicles chapter 10 verse 14. Here Rehoboam is talking to the people who represent the tribes. The tribes are saying that when Solomon was king, he put heavy burdens on us, lighten our burdens, and we'll serve you. Rehoboam gives him their answer, and in his answer he says, now I tell you, this is from the NIV, now I tell you, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. In the English Standard Version, it's translated, my father's thigh. In the New American Standard Bible, it's translated, my father's loins. Yes. The answer is yes. He is probably insulting his father's manhood in a way that no man wants to be insulted. He is saying, Rehoboam is saying, that my little finger is bigger than my father's male part. How do you translate that in such a way that communicates that that's the boast he's making, and you can read it in church? Well, there you see how the NIV, the English Standard, and the New American Standard translate it, where it gives you a little bit of a hint. I mean, anybody reading that goes, I bet he's talking about, yep, he probably is, you know. So there you can see how it is possible to communicate what is probably euphemism without actually using euphemism and so forth. And with that, I think that wraps up why we see so many differences as people have tried to translate. There is a little bit of a science to translation. There's also a little bit of art in translating. How do we take this concept and how do we communicate it in such a way that the English reader will understand what's going on? I'll give you an example from my own experience just recently. Dave emailed me. He emailed me to tell my wife that Linda would be covering children's church. When I was replying to my wife then very quickly, I wrote very quickly, Linda is going to take care of the kids this Sunday. Now, did I say exactly what David said? No, I didn't. Did I communicate what David was communicating? I absolutely did, and my wife knew when she read it, she knew who Linda was, she knew what take care of the kids on Sunday means, and therefore, that translation, although I used different words, it was understood. And that's what's going on when people are translating. They're translating it in a way that they want you to grasp. They want you to understand what the ancient source said, but they want to say it in a way that the modern English speaker will be able to grasp, will be able to understand. It's not going to be a mystery to them. I like the time that Babylon Bee, the online satirical website, said that pastor with the King James Version had to do a deep word study of ancient English. And that is so true when it comes to various things. Keeping in mind that I'm a student of the New American Standard. I've actually read the American Standard, and I'm a fan of the New American Standard. Why? Because it took what the American Standard had already done, and it modified it. One, with more documents, that is the manuscripts that have been found, and the information that we have now on what is more likely to be the original reading than a variant reading. Two, it's also concerned with putting it in language that you and I speak. Language that you and I communicate in, and we just know right away what words mean, what a sentence means, and therefore. With that, we're going to wrap it up, and next we're going to do the problem of evil. Hey guys, Ozzy here. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found it helpful. If you found it helpful, I would truly, truly, truly appreciate it if you would share it. Share it with a friend, share it with a family member, share it on social media, what have you. Keep in touch with us. We're going to have more classes coming up, and so I'm going to get these online, and I'm going to try and address topics that are relevant and people are looking at in Christianity. I do appreciate you. Go ahead and hit the subscribe button if you want. But keep in touch, and again, I just want to thank you.